And a warm-hearted good morning. Welcome to yet another edition of Brandpunt, where we look at relevant issues and controversial issues that affect our Christian world on a daily basis. We recently received a email from a Christian View Network, the man at the top of the helm there, Philip Rosenthal. And the email said the following. On this morning, 21st of February 2023, the ruling party voted for each of the 7 worst possible options for the hate speech and hate crimes bill, which threatens to shut down controversial free speech like mainland China did to Hong Kong. Well, after this email, we decided to contact Philip Rosenthal to find out what the latest is on the hate speech and hate crimes bill. So on the line, all the way from Cape Town this morning, Philip Rosenthal. It's once been said, for evil to prosper, good man has to do nothing. Then again, we need to confirm the facts, the story behind the story. Do stay tuned, as we'll be chatting to Philip Rosenthal right after this. Well, as promised, we've got the man at the helm of Christian View Network down in Cape Town, Philip Rosenthal, to tell us more about this hate speech and hate crimes bill, the latest on it. Philip, the email that we received from you said on the 21st of February, the ruling party voted for each, and you called it the 7 worst possible options for the hate speech and hate crimes bill. You even said it threatens to shut down controversial free speech, same as China did with Hong Kong. What is this all about? What is the latest on the hate speech and hate crimes bill?
Well, I think there's 2 parts to the question that you've asked. The first part is what exactly was voted on Tuesday, and the second part is what is the process going forward. The first part is that there were 7 options within this bill that were proposed by opposition parties that would have made this bill gentler and less likely to put innocent people in jail. But unfortunately, none of those proposals were agreed to. And so this leaves the door wide open for innocent people to be prosecuted for controversial speech and not really genuine hate speech. So, for example, the definition of harm includes what they would call social, economic, and psychological harm. Now, what is social harm? Even the Department of Justice couldn't explain properly what they meant by social harm so that a court would have a clear idea of what it was. Then the call for economic harm, if an organization then calls for a boycott of a business because they don't agree with their practices, then they could say, well, they call you inciting economic harm. And so that could be criminally prosecuted. And again, now we're talking not just about a civil prosecution as in the Equality Act, but a criminal prosecution that could put people in jail and give you a criminal record. And then there's also psychological harm, which anybody who can say, okay, well, I'm upset or I'm offended. The risk is, as they have done before, that they will say that about things which they find offensive, including Christian viewpoints. So we've learned from various court cases that we cannot rely on the courts to interpret these things in an objective and realistic manner. And so leaving those things wide open is very dangerous to religious and political free speech. Then the second problem is that the exemptions clause, which is supposed to protect religious, academic, and media freedom, is phrased in such a way that it's actually smoke and mirrors. It's not actually going to give the protection that it pretends to do. So what it effectively does is it only protects against the actual harm that somebody might suffer from the words that are spoken, such as if they are upset because they hear something that they don't agree with. But what it doesn't protect against is somebody motivating other people to a certain course of action which they don't agree with and which they might argue is social harm. Now, we would agree that if somebody is motivating people to physically harm another person, then that shouldn't be legal. That should be illegal. But if it's just what they call social harm, then that means that anybody who motivates something which the other person is not happy with, and can then just put in this vague allegation and get penalized for that.
Yeah, Philip.
And then
Philip, I just want to come in here. So it actually would depend on the opinion of the judge, on how he feels and how he sees the case, isn't it?
Yes, that is the case, and we've seen, for example, things that I think I would consider to be completely unreasonable. For example, the judge ruled that flying the old South African flag was hate speech. Now, I don't personally have an interest in flying the old South African flag, but don't think that it's fair to compare that with somebody who is actually inciting violence. And we've actually seen another case where a group was singing "Kill the Boer," and then the judge said, well, that's not hate speech. So this can be very arbitrary and dependent on the opinion of the judge, unless it is defined very clearly in law, which we believe this is not clear at all. So it's extremely dangerous. But the other thing which in this proposal that was voted on Tuesday, which I think is absurd, is that they're putting a penalty of 8 years in jail maximum. Now, that is more than the penalty for housebreaking. So somebody just speaking something that somebody else finds offensive and construes as social harm could then be up for an 8-year jail sentence, which to me doesn't seem proportionate at all. And it could be entirely innocent, as is the case with the Finnish minister previously of police, who's now posted a Bible verse on social media and is now on trial for doing so. So this law is extremely dangerous, and in many ways, to me, this does compare with what mainland China is doing to shut down free speech in Hong Kong. So I think we have to oppose this. And the other thing is that they could have had a narrow list of grounds for hate speech, such as which is in the unprotected speech in the Constitution, which is just race, religion, gender, but they have not done so. They put a huge wide list of grounds, which leaves it open for any offended or upset person to bring allegations that are not necessarily fair. To me, this is extremely dangerous and something that we have to oppose. But then in terms of the process, this is just one stage in a long process, and it still has to go to the Parliament, the National Assembly, for a vote, and it's then got to go to the National Council of Provinces, then it has to go to the President, and then it will be taken to the Constitutional Court. I've been told that people are planning to do that. So we're going to be fighting this every step of the way.
Very interestingly enough, one of the concerns that you had as well as to push the bill through, apparently it was 3 members of the ruling party who were called in to participate and who had missed most of the previous discussions. What is the story behind that?
Well, I think this is really a big problem, because the one hopes that politicians, if they're going to vote on a law, have applied their minds and listened to the arguments that are put forward by the interested parties and the opposition parties so that they can vote intelligently. But on this committee, they had the ruling party had a majority, but half of their people did not attend the meetings. But then eventually they got tired of this debate and discussion, and they called them back in to vote. But then they hadn't heard the reasons why these laws are a problem. In my view, that is extremely unfair and unacceptable, because they're not voting intelligently. They kind of just keeping their jobs and doing what they're told.
During the deliberations, it came to the fore that the opposition parties, and I'm not going to name all of them, but they all expressed strong views against the bill in principle. What do you think is the solution? I think you're arguing to scrap the bill, but what is the way forward? Is there a solution?
I think the thing is that people tend to have an idea that somebody else's viewpoint can be silenced, but they don't want their viewpoint to be silenced. And prior to 1994, the members of the current ruling party had all experienced being silenced by the previous government. And so they were quite in favor of free speech, and they were concerned that this idea of government silencing people shouldn't happen again. But we've got a new generation who've now come into parliament and into government that didn't have that experience of being silenced. But we have opposition parties that are concerned that this bill can be used against them. And I think that, unfortunately, the ruling party has not thought about how this bill can be used against them. And what we have seen, even in other countries, the people who motivated for hate speech laws were later themselves prosecuted by other people who weren't happy with what they've said. So historically, since the time of the Reformation, one's had a struggle in Europe between different factions, political groups, religious groups, which took turns to kind of oppress the other groups. And eventually they came to an agreement that they didn't want this to carry on. And so they preferred the approach of allowing free speech for everybody and religious freedom for everybody, which is much safer because the government cannot be relied on to determine what is truth. And then that gives an open space for everybody. But now we have people who have kind of forgotten that history and are wanting to have another go at seeing if they can do something better, but we would really advise against that.
Hence your argument then to scrap the bill, the solution, and if that can't be done, I see you say, well, you have a narrow definition of hate speech with a broad set of exemptions to protect religious and academic and media freedom. Just tell me a little bit about that.
We've proposed specifically 8 changes to this bill, which were supported by opposition parties, and just by changing 1 or 2 words in different clauses, places, we could make it much less likely that innocent people would go to jail. And we could discuss the detail of that. We'd also proposed another 12 changes that haven't been agreed to yet by the opposition parties, but the ruling party did not support any of those. One thing that is encouraging is that the ruling party did agree to make 2 changes that were proposed. The one was to delete what they called cultural harm, and because the Department of Justice could not explain what cultural harm meant. So that is a good piece of progress. And the second piece of progress is that they agreed that any regulations that the government makes about this must go to Parliament 60 days beforehand so that they would have a chance to check those regulations weren't abusing us further. So those are 2 positive victories, and we hope that as this bill moves through Parliament, they will agree to more of these. But just for example, inserting 1 word into the exemption clause, which is the word physical, which was supported by the opposition parties but opposed by the majority party, that just 1 word would completely change the exemption clause in order to make it meaningful. But at the moment, it's smoke and mirrors. It's not protecting us.
Right. You said earlier on that the bill is now due to go to the National Assembly for a vote, after which it will go to the National Council of Provinces and then to the President. You foresee a Constitutional Court challenge?
Definitely, yes. I've been told that that is being proposed, and we certainly would input into that. And I'm also very encouraged that a group of academics put forward a paper, which you can see on superlinear.co.za, about how social media can be manipulated. And so this whole concept of social harm, it can be very subjective when people are making perceptions that are not actually real. I think that the battle is not over by any means, and I'm encouraged very much that the opposition parties have supported these changes and edits to the bill.
Right. We've got 400,000 listeners. What would the next step be? What can we do as Christians? But what should the next step be for our listeners, the man in the street, there where the grass turns into a goat, so to speak?
Well, I think we really in a wonderful situation in that because of the internet, you can speak to these leaders directly. And the email address of the person who is motivating this bill is deputyminister@justice.gov.za. And you could send him an email to ask him to listen to us. But I think that something which is everybody can do is prayer. And one of the difficulties is that we can get deceived into thinking that authority is in the hands of the political system, but actually the Bible says that God is the ultimate authority and he is the one who listens to our prayers. So Jesus is the ruler over all, and he is the first person that we need to speak to intervene, and he rules over all kings and authorities. Then the second issue is that Jesus said in the Great Commission that we must go into all the world and speak the good news to all creation. So we have to keep speaking up, and we've got the example in the book of Acts of the apostles who kept speaking up even when they were told that they were not allowed to, and they said that we must obey God rather than man. Now, obviously, we must try and be respectful to other people in the way that we say things, but we mustn't stop speaking up what the Bible says. Then thirdly, I think we must remember that God is sovereign over what seems like a defeat in human terms, and can use these defeats for his glory. And we see this, the cross was the biggest example of an apparent defeat, but God, through the resurrection, turned that around. And we also see in the book of Daniel, for example, that the Jews at the time were trying to make sense of their defeat by Nebuchadnezzar, when he carried them into exile. But the book of Daniel shows in Daniel chapter 2 that God's kingdom is sovereign over all empires and will ultimately crush them, and that victory is not achieved through our human strength, but it is achieved through his sovereign power. So, which we see in Daniel chapter 7, that it was because God as judge made a ruling in favor of the saints. It was not because the saints were politically strong and defeated all their enemies. So I think further than that, we need to trust in God rather than human political strength or in democracy, but we can use the opportunities that democracy opens for us to speak to our leaders, to lobby them, and to get the message out in the public arena.
That is what Christian View Network stands for, a lobby group speaking out against, and as Philip said, lobbying our leaders. In closing, I'm chatting to Philip Rosenthal from Christian View Network down in Cape Town about the latest on the hate speech and hate crimes bill. The battle belongs to the Lord. Now we as Christians can fight it further on our knees. Your final thought, I wanted to ask you about, we're not just reporting on political news, but also how we look at it through the biblical view of politics. Your final thoughts, Philip.
Firstly, I'd like to encourage the listeners to stay up to date with what's happening, which will be sure to change from week to week. And you can see that on Facebook/Christian View Network. We will be posting the latest news on this. But I also would say that in the past, we have suffered what seemed like defeats before, which God turned into victories. And in fact, at the University of Cape Town campus many years ago, where I was a student, the student government banned a pamphlet with Bible verses on the controversial issue of homosexuality. And all that this resulted in is that all the students became interested to read what the Bible said that they had been banned and not allowed to hear, which previously they wouldn't have been so interested to find out. And we just carried on distributing these things anyway, because we're not going to let the authorities ban the Bible. So I think we've got to do the same now, and we've got to tell the government and the courts what the Bible says, whether they like it or not.
With that, our sincere thanks to Philip Rosenthal for sharing with us the latest on the hate speech and hate crimes bill. We'll be following this case with interest, and thank you so much for chatting to us and our listeners this morning. And God bless you. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Tim.
Well, we trust that you enjoyed this morning's program and that after what you heard, you can now make an informed decision on the topic of discussion. Do take note that the opinions stated in this program is not necessarily that of Radio Pulpit or the announcer on duty, but there for you, our listener, to make that informed decision. Till next time, keep well, God bless you, and shalom.